Chapter 33, Section 1. Vietnam is located in Southeast Asia. If you're to look at the geography of Vietnam, it's mostly hills and forest, even jungle, you could say. If you're to look at the past, the history of Vietnam, they had a pretty rough past fighting for their independence. During the 1800s, imperialism was definitely going to take its effect on Vietnam. The French were going to take over Vietnam in 1883. And they're going to take over more than just Vietnam. They're going to take over Laos and Cambodia as well. And they're going to combine this together to form French Indochina. Now, the people of Vietnam didn't necessarily want to be ruled by another country, a European country especially. And you're going to have a lot of nationalist feelings remain in Vietnam, and they're going to be led by Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh had lived in the U.S. for a while, he had lived in the Soviet Union for a while, he had lived in China for a while, and what we know about two of those three places, they're communist. And Ho Chi Minh had become committed to the ideals of communism. As we get into the 1940s, World War II is breaking out. The Japanese are going to occupy French Indochina because the French were more concerned about France as it was being taken over by the Nazis. And Ho Chi Minh's going to see this as his chance to get back into Vietnam. In 1941, secretly he returns to Vietnam, where he's going to form the League for the Independence of Vietnam, trying to resist this occupation by the Japanese. For short, the group was called the Viet Minh. When Japan gets defeated in World War II, the Viet Minh declare independence. And they even try to get U.S. support for this. But the French came back, and the French said, all right, we're back. World War II is over. We're not worried about France as much anymore. We're back. We never gave up control of you. And Ho Chi Minh is going to ask Truman for help. You know, the United States, we were a proponent of countries ruling themselves and people getting determining their governments for themselves. And so he sends a letter to Truman pleading for help here. But the U.S. decides to support France. Because you see, France was a vital ally against communism, and we don't like Ho Chi Minh's ties to communism. After Truman, you have Eisenhower. Eisenhower is going to follow Truman's example. Eisenhower was afraid that if Vietnam fell to communism, then the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. This is going to be called the domino theory. If Vietnam falls and then Laos could fall, then Cambodia, then Thailand, and where does it stop? We can't let, communism spread. So by the time we get to 54, we were paying most of the cost of the French war in Vietnam. We weren't fighting in Vietnam, the French were. France didn't have the money though, so we were paying for most of this cost. And the thing is, the French were still losing. You see, the Viet Minh's guerrilla tactics were no match for the money or the high-tech equipment. The Viet Minh would choose when they were going to attack, where they're going to attack, they'd hit, and then they would disappear back into the jungles. The French wanted to fight more of a conventional battle. Our military there against your military. The Viet Minh didn't want to fight that kind of a battle. They knew they couldn't win that kind of a battle. The French are going to try to lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle at Dien Bien Phu. This is deep inside the Viet Minh held northern part of Vietnam. And it was not very long before you saw 13,000 French surrounded by 50,000 Viet Minh. The French hope we will come in and help them out. Ike does not want to commit troops to Vietnam so soon after Korea had just ended a year before this. May 7th, 1954. The French are going to be forced to surrender at Dien Bien Phu. Beginning one day later, you're going to have the Geneva Conference to try to settle this whole Indochina conflict. And at the Geneva Conference, you're going to have a variety of groups there. You've got the French there, obviously, because French Indochina, they thought this was their land. You have the Viet Minh there, obviously, because the Viet Minh were the ones saying that this should be theirs. Cambodia's there because they were part of French Indochina. Great Britain's there as an ally of France. Laos is part of French Indochina. The communists were there backing their friends, the Viet Minh. They didn't want us to have a lot of influence there. They liked the communist ties there. The Soviet Union is backing the communists. And then we're there trying to back the French because we don't want to see communism control all of Vietnam. So at this conference, we're all there. One thing we can't agree on is a ceasefire. Stop shooting. But they get no definite settlement. They agree to divide Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel. The north would be controlled by the Viet Minh, and the south would be controlled by the French. And this is a temporary division because in July of 56, they're going to hold elections to reunify the country. Viet Minh, put your person forward. French, put your person forward. Winner take all. We hated this agreement. We hated it. Because according to this agreement, there's a chance that the communists could win. And there's nothing we could do about it. The guy that Ike hoped would win support of the South was Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was staunchly anti-communist. He had spent years in the U.S. We knew this guy. This is who we wanted as the candidate for the South. In 1955, he is elected President of the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam. Elected. It was rigged. He cheated. Let me give you an example. If you look down there in the South, the capital down there was Saigon. In Saigon, there was 450,000 registered voters. 450,000 registered voters. Somehow Diem gets 605,000 votes in Saigon. He cheated. Diem knows he can't beat Ho Chi Minh. The North is going to run Ho Chi Minh. You got Diem in the South. Diem had to cheat to get him elected in the South. And so Diem figures out how he's not going to lose to Ho Chi Minh. When July of 56 comes around and they're supposed to have the election, Diem refuses to have the elections in the South. You can't lose the election if you don't have the election. Diem's regime is not popular for a variety of different reasons. The Buddhists don't like him because he was Catholic, and all of his policies favored the Catholics. The peasants don't like him because he had all of his policies favoring the wealthy landowners. People aren't happy because the only people in power were part of Diem's family. Diem was ruthless to his enemies. He would torture, imprison his opponents. Diem's not very popular. You're going to start seeing revolutions in the South against Diem. By 59, the revolutions in the South were getting assistance from the Viet Minh in the North. In 1960, in the South, the Viet Minh are going to form the National Liberation Front. The members of this were called the Vietcong. These were the Vietnamese communists. Their goal was to overthrow Diem. Now, not all supporters were communist. Some were peasants that hated Diem. Some were people who feared Diem. If you join them, you don't got to fear them. Some were people that feared the Viet Cong. If you can't beat them, join them. The Viet Cong were terrorists. They used terror tactics. They killed hundreds of government officials. And it wasn't very long before much of the countryside was going to be under control of the Viet Cong.